We are really grateful that you are here today. My name is Jason Toriano. I am a faculty member, Bloomfield College of Montclair State University, and I'm really thrilled to be here today. My job is to take you through a bit of the program. And so I want to start by giving you a brief overview of RIGS, of our speakers, and also to share with you that this is being recorded. It will be shared on the RIGS site, and also that the slides from the presentation today will also be available on the RIGS site next week. I want to share with you a little bit about RIGS. As we said, this is hosted by RIGS. So welcome to today's event. It is hosted by the Research on Interdisciplinary Global Studies here at Montclair State University. As many of you may know already, RIGS is a vibrant hub for innovative research and cross-disciplinary collaboration, dedicated to addressing some of the most pressing global challenges of our time. Our work spans a range of critical themes, each designed to foster deeper understanding and real-world solutions. The program focuses on several key areas, which I'm going to provide a brief overview of right now. The human rights and social justice, where we explore issues related to equity, inclusion, and the fight against systemic oppression on a global scale. RIGS also looks at sustainable development, which examines the balance between economic growth, environmental preservation, and social equity. This includes research on climate change, resource management, and the transition toward green economies. Migration and global displacement is another key area, and that addresses the complexities surrounding the refugee crisis, forced migration, the socio-political factors driving displacement across regions. Digital and technological transformations, where we critically assess the impact of AI, digital tools, and technology on governance, diplomacy, and social movements. And finally, peace building and conflict resolution, where we engage with efforts to mediate conflict, foster reconciliation, and promote peaceful coexistence in post-conflict societies. Through these themes, RIGS strives to push the boundaries of traditional academic discourse, promote collaboration between scholars, practitioners, and activists. We believe that by connecting disciplines and viewpoints, we can better address the global challenges we face today and provide meaningful, actionable insights. We're really grateful that you're all here today, and I look forward to the rich discussions and collaborative spirit that will guide our work today. Again, a reminder that the Q&A, if you're just joining us, is in the lower right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. You can put a question in there at any stage, and we will ask those questions when we get to that point in the program. Another reminder for all of you, this is being recorded, and the slides and the video will be available on the RIGS site in due course. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce two folks who are here on the Zoom call with us today. Athne Schwartz, PhD, is a full professor in the Department of Management in the Business School at Montclair State University. She's a South African native and earned her PhD at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. At Montclair, she teaches entrepreneurship classes at the graduate and undergraduate levels, and she's co-chair of the university's Global Reach Task Force, collaborating with the Associate Provost for Hispanic Initiatives and International Programs and Academic Affairs. She's a Fulbright Scholar and a Research Associate at the Gordon Institute of Business Science at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Her research focuses on entrepreneurship and gender, digital transformation, and emerging economies. I also want to introduce you to David Axelrod, who is a researcher at Project Aeroslab at Montclair State University. He's taught for 8 years and developed the course Economics of Time and Mind, as well as co-developed Religion and Economics with professor at Montclair, Professor John Soboslai. I hope I got that name correct. He's also recorded a series of podcasts for the business school. Previously, he worked in the financial sector for 20 years. David received his PhD in economics from Rutgers University. He plays electric bass and produced over a dozen albums of original music. David's research has its foundation in issues around time preference, experiences as economic products and resources, and the mind as a scarce resource that can be developed and grown. So those are the introductions. Those are some of the housekeeping matters that I wanted to make everybody aware of. We are so glad that you are all here. And now over to all of you. Thanks.
Jason, that was wonderful. So I am going to start us off by providing some context for the series that I've worked with David Axelrod and some of our RIGS university fellows and professors to produce for this semester. And I'd like to just very briefly provide a sense of why we believe that this particular topic was very important. During the series in the fall and then again in the spring semester, we are going to look at what we are all experiencing, the fact that AI is igniting really fundamental changes in the way that we function in our economic roles. And of course, simultaneously, new conceptions of justice have emerged. David and I spoke a lot during the summer about how the technologies of today will not only produce new ways of understanding justice, but also experiences of justice. And we searched around for a bit and we landed on this term called justice entrepreneurship, which is here defined as the tangible as well as the intangible experiences in relation to fairness, equity, and reparation. We also wanted to provide an interdisciplinary focus because that is what RIGS is all about. And so we thought that it would be very important to approach this from a conception of the fundamental difference between how, if you are in the business school as a student or a researcher or a professor, you look at these issues using very different fundamental understanding and maybe reading that inspires a different understanding from folks who've come through the humanities and the social sciences. Many of us, of course, straddle that boundary. We don't believe that there is necessarily a very or that the boundary is impermeable. We believe very fundamentally that that boundary has to be straddled. And so we want to understand and educate our students about where that sort of split or how the difference in vantage point occurs. And so in terms of business economics, here we're focusing on market behavior. We're trying to understand things like prices, interest rates, right? With the intent of trying to make sure that a business entity is profitable. Increasingly, of course, we also include some other measures because we understand that given the sort of big global challenges, profitability cannot be the only responsibility that managers or owners of businesses deliver. But the foundations of business are based on developments in the 19th century. Right? And David obviously will be exploring that today, where in economics, we're looking at a much more sort of quantitative approach to profit and utility maximization, where we're trying to be much more predictive. Clearly, in entrepreneurship, we challenge some of those assumptions because we believe that there are also other ways that we can look, particularly at the behavior of entrepreneurs and innovators. And so that's the kind of thinking that we want to explore throughout the series by bringing together people who come from these very different perspectives. The humanities and social sciences were, again, influenced by scholars mainly from European traditions, Marx and Engels, we highlight here, where they start with trying to understand how capitalism works. And obviously, as these traditions continue, provide a criticism of capitalism. And it's really very important to bring these sort of different perspectives together because you end up with a much more holistic understanding of the trends that we experience, and quite frankly, can be experienced as very frustrating and very difficult to understand. So before I hand over to David, I would like to draw your attention to our next seminars. And so we want to see you back in October, on October 16th. We have yet to determine a time, but again, we'll use a webinar format. Dr. Daniela Jimenez from Dortmund University is a close colleague and associate of mine. Her research focuses on entrepreneurship, looking at emerging economies as well, particularly Latin America. And I'll be in dialogue with her, looking at the themes of our overall, the focus of the overall semester, looking at entrepreneurship, justice in terms of entrepreneurship, and less so on AI, but we'll be looking at sustainability in particular. And clearly some of the questions we will ask is, how can we make sure that the gains that we've been able to achieve prior to the AI revolution, that we don't lose those gains? How can we make sure during the age of AI, we actually manage to advance rather than see a setback to those sustainability gains made by entrepreneurs in various parts of the world? In November, we will have Robert Bernard from PwC, and he will speak about risk during this era. And now I'm going to hand over to David. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Ethne. Thank you, Jason, for the very, very kind introductions. Justice in the context of holistic economics. I don't think we're going to, it doesn't look like we're going to be playing the music, but this was an album cover from one of my albums in 1995, which was called One Vote Zygote. So just a sense for everyone that's watching, a lot of the issues we're dealing with today in justice and politics that have been around a long time. Just a reminder, this is an invitation. We're starting a discussion, but we're trying to bring in many different voices and viewpoints. See some definitions for justice and just and holistic and economics. Okay, so this is the framework that's behind this presentation, and this is from the course Economics of Time, Mind, and Spirit. There's four main parts: nomics, time, mind, and spirit. Under nomics is the nature of decision-making, experiences as economic goods, and holonomics. Under time, there's time as resource and product. Time is distance to an event, and time is a constraint on decision-making. Mind, we look at brain structure and how we make decisions, then economics of mind, then specialization of consciousness. And spirit, we deal with egonomics, so that's the management of self, relationship modality, decision-making, and sustainability. So we don't have the time to go over every one of these today, but we'll be able to invoke a few of these along the way. Okay, so why nomics? Well, if you go with Greek mythology, you have nomos as an aspect of Zeus, with the father of decay or justice. So no surprise there if we're going to talk about justice. If you look at the word economics, derives from ikos or oikos for household and nomos management. So nomics is sort of stepping back even behind economics, and will refer to all aspects of governing or managing in its broadest sense. And again, the notion of, where is the commonality of School of Business and humanities and social sciences? One way of looking at this is that the grounding connection is at nomics, and one will focus more on nomics of its external environment, and the other will focus a little bit more on nomics of internal environment. But as Ethne said before, these are not hard and fast boundaries. They are, in fact, very permeable. And certainly here at Riggs, we're very, very aware of not only that there are issues, but they create feedback loops, right? So what we do in the business world, what we do in macroeconomics, impacts our social relationships. It impacts our sense of identity, who we are, who we want to be. And that informs, well, what are our priorities, our values? Where do we want to invest not only our money, but our time, our energy, and our attitudes. Okay. And so hinted at a little bit before, Ethne, thank you very much, is in economics, we talk about the distinction between positive and normative economics. Positive is more fact-like, and normative is more about judgment. But we can go a little bit deeper. Positive has the sort of descriptive component, so it's historical-like, what happened. Predictive, scientific-like, what will happen or what is likely to happen. Then prescriptive, that's managerial-like, what does one decide to happen? And then proscriptive, that's more political-like, because that's talking about what should happen. And as hopefully everyone's getting a sense of, all of these come into play when you're making decisions, when you're dealing with economics. Okay, so let's start off with decision-making and understanding that, because that'll be at the core of everything we talk about today. So in standard decision-making, the realm of constraints or limitations or range of alternatives, that's what we refer to as what is feasible. So if someone says that's not feasible, they're trying to tell you, you may want to do that, but we can't do it. On the others, related to this, though, are preferences, motivations, or rankings of alternatives, something you might refer to as the desirable. And essentially, in technical terms, in economics, we refer to constrained optimization mathematically, and that's where we combine the feasible and the desirable. Now, where we're going to move on from is a more holistic viewpoint. And here we have to deal with the distinction between exogenous and endogenous and external and internal. So in terms of constraints and limitations, if they are exogenously determined, so exogenous, origin outside of ourselves as the decision maker, that's the realm of the feasible, okay, what you could do. Endogenous refers to the constraints that one is choosing or placing on oneself. And notice this notion of self can vary. So if you're talking about the individual, then, it's sort of, your own individual mind. But if you're talking about society, then when you're dealing with, let's say, the realm of the political, within the society, within the country, that is a form of endogenous constraint, right? If you're choosing to make certain laws to live by, it is as if they're endogenous. Now, at the individual level, it may feel exogenous, okay? But in terms of the society as a whole, in terms of a business as a whole, that's endogenous. So we want to be clear on these distinctions. And similarly with preferences and motivations, there's preferences about the external world. So that's the realm of desirable, what we want to have, what we want to do. And then there's preferences over the internal. In other words, preferences over who we are as a person, as a decision maker. And this is the realm of the inspirable, okay? So in everyday English, choose what you most want to do as long as you can do it. It's not what you shouldn't do, and you're being your best self, okay? From standpoint of technical English, holistic rationality, choosing the behavior that maximizes utility given one's external preferences, such that the behavior is both feasible and acceptable, okay? Now, bringing in the holistic, technical, and in a moment, the mathematical, because as we move ahead trying to talk about AI, it's not just about AI as a black box that we don't understand what's going on. It's also asking, what are we doing in the algorithms, in the programming itself? Okay, so mathematically speaking, if you're trying to deal with behaviors and resources and what we call the feasible alternative set, that's the exogenous constraints. There's the acceptable alternative set, that's the endogenous constraints, external preferences, internal preferences. You can all put it together where U is the objective function, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. And you're trying to maximize the utility of the behavior given the external preferences, which are in themselves dependent on internal preferences and the resources we have available, such that the behavior is both feasible and acceptable. And what we consider acceptable is also based on internal preferences. So who you choose to be informs what you find desirable, what are your priorities, okay, what are your values, but it also informs what is it that you find acceptable. So if you want to go into a career in medicine, the preferred outcomes might be healthier individuals, but an acceptable criteria would be do no harm, right? First, do no harm. That's a statement about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Okay. And if you try to put this into mnemonic, it would be you be fair. Okay. Now, taking all of this gives us a second interdisciplinary essence, and that is the realm of the feasible, that is dealing with science and technology. The realm of the acceptable, that's dealing with politics, religion, morals. This is all roughly speaking. The desirable, we're dealing with art and aesthetics. And the inspirable, we're dealing with humanities, the spiritual counseling. So using the holistic decision-making framework, we see immediately how this connects with the interdisciplinary. And why we do push for this, because they're all interrelated. We try to ignore it, we're missing too many big pieces. Okay. So that was standard decision making and then holistic decision making. Now, what about decision trees? This is a framework for understanding if you have a choice that you're making now and it leads to other choices and decisions you have to make in the future and keep going and going and going, we often present it as a decision tree. And so this is presented as there's a root node, sort of like the decision you're going to make right now. And then things will branch off. And this only has a couple of steps, but this can go many, 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 many steps. So you'd have branches leading to other branches, and then wherever the final outcomes are, those are sort of the leaves. So you can imagine a decision tree being quite complex, but at its core is this notion of the root node. Okay, so this is where we're going to really start going a little bit different. And that is decision-making is not just a mechanical thing. All right, there is experiencing decision-making. And as you will notice, I've used generative AI to try to make some nice images. And where I do, I try to let you know what the prompt is. And in this case, the prompt was decision tree as neuron with past and future. And yes, I am trying to encourage this notion of there's a relationship between decision trees and how neurons look. Right? For those who are familiar with neurons, there's dendrites, and then there's a soma, there's a body, and then there's axons, and then they connect with each other through synapses. And so one of the distinctions we're dealing with here then is what is it that we experience as we're making a decision, and recognizing that we're making decisions about what we're going to experience. So there is this, again, fundamental feedback loop going on. Okay, so root node as the present moment of potentials to be managed. Okay. Then there are the feasible futures based on the decisions we make now. And then there are the plausible histories that nurture our decisions. And I will get back to this in a moment. But the key notion here is that when we make decisions, we don't just make changes about what can happen, so changing the probabilities of what will happen. We also impact the likelihood of what has happened. Okay, in particular, our understanding of our own history, of other people's history. So to really kind of drive this home, if you go from looking at your past as something you didn't have any control out of, okay, right? It was beyond your control. And then at some point in your life, you have a recognition of, well, actually, I made a choice then. That not only has a potential for empowerment, but it also challenges us to consider, well, what were my priorities? Do I still have those same priorities? So there's a big difference between you did something because you had no choice, and you did something and you did have a choice, even if it didn't feel like you had a choice at that time. Okay. And I also want to make this distinction between probability and likelihood, because probability is dealing with sort of the odds of what will happen. Okay, it hasn't happened yet, but it will happen. And likelihood is referring more to, well, what was the odds, or what is the way we want to conceive what has happened in the past? And it's a recognition that as we move along in life, as we move along through the events of society, we don't just change the future in our decisions, we change how we understand our past. Let me just, I'm going to take a very, very, very minor break. Do we have any questions on the material so far? Nothing yet?
No, nothing yet.
Okay.
As a reminder, everybody, you can note your questions in the Q&A in the lower right-hand corner of the Zoom. Back to you, David.
Thank you. All right. So now bringing AI in a little bit more specifically. So at the core of the operation of AI is the objective function. All right. This is the function that is a mathematical expression of the rankings of potential solutions. And these solutions are going to be based on data and parameters, criteria. And so part of who AI is being, right, in terms of, well, what are its biases? And this is certainly a very big issue in terms of like the art that's created, or if you're asking to do a literature review, okay, you know, what's included, what's not included. There is that constrained optimization at its core. And so if we're going to be serious about having AI express our values, what's acceptable, what's desirable, you know, who do we want to be? In some sense, we have to be able to get into that objective function. Now, yes, that's going to be very technical. So those of you that have a nice technical background, that's going to be part of your responsibility. Okay, get in there. You know, what is going on with this objective function? Can we make it more inclusive? Those of you who are not technical, well, I challenge you to develop those skill sets. But if you don't like them, or you don't want to do that, that's fine. But understand that if you want to have a say in what's developing with AI, you're going to have to work with someone who's got some kind of technical background. Okay. And again, this is the importance of doing interdisciplinary work. It's one thing to say, I don't like doing math, I don't want to do math. It's another to say, no one should do math. Okay, so let's tie in justice into those four categories: the feasible, the acceptable, the desirable, and the inspirable. So how we choose our objective functions and our endogenous constraints are based on how close they are to expressing who we want to be. So this is justice as social identity, or as Arnaud has been using the phrase being justice. Okay. And so the image here, actually using the prompt, justice as social identity. I find very interesting what images get created. Okay. But here we go, you know, sense of who we are. Justice as the desirable. So this is how we consider alternatives based on how close they are generating a just outcome. And that distance is a variable in the objective function. We're going to talk a little bit more about distance and measures of justice in a little bit. So this is justice as a social aesthetic. So the feeling justice. And this is going to be very important because social aesthetic has a slightly different feel and meaning than, in terms of mores or having boundaries, right? Or having specific laws. And I would argue that one of the challenges that we have in dealing with different perspectives on justice is being able to be clear in that distinction between the aesthetic and the more. Okay. All right. So justice is the acceptable. So limit consideration of alternatives to only those that are within our endogenous constraints. So this is justice as social boundaries, that phrase of shaping justice. And again, here's the image with, this is the frame. Whatever you're going to choose from, it has to be inside that frame. Okay. Now, what about justice and the feasible? So here, we have to look at the intersection of the exogenous and endogenous constraints, okay? Because not everything that is acceptable is going to be feasible, right? So maybe we would like to have a set of laws that says, hey, everybody should get what the average income is in society. Maybe you have, that's your sense of justice, that would be, a way to go. But from purely mathematical standpoint, if you're, if everyone's getting divvied up, the same amount, there is no more, there is no less. That may not be feasible, right? For a number of reasons. But here we're dealing with the issue of the imperative of what is acceptable. If it does not overlay with what we can do, okay, with what's feasible, then you end up with what we can call the impossible situation. All right. You're saying you won't accept any alternatives except, over here. But the only things that are available are over here. And now you have nothing to choose from. And so there is this issue of, do we maintain what is acceptable, our sense of what's inviolable, or do we allow that to evolve so that we have some autonomy? And that's going to be relevant because if we're going to have justice, if we're going to have justice experiences, then it's about justice as a social product. It's about producing justice. And if our sense of what is acceptable doesn't overlay with what's feasible, then you don't get a say in a tangible way. Any questions so far before I go on to the next step?
I will ask you then about the implications of what you are saying. And I'm here thinking about some of the implications for our students specifically. What are the implications for our students of thinking about the future here in terms of skill development? I'm reminded a few slides back, you were speaking about you may not like a particular, you may not like math or philosophy, or, we accept that AI is very driven by the development of technology. And so as you look at student careers in the future, what sort of skill development do you think do we as educators have to think about, but also in terms of career development, the choices that people make?
Yes, very, very good question. I'm reminded of a quote of, I think it was Paul Samuelson, economist back from 30s, 40s, 50s, was sort of when he was really taking off. And the comment that, and because he was one of the earlier economists that were starting to get very heavy into math, and his quote was, "Math is a language." Now, if you were to talk to someone from a different country, from a different culture, and you wanted to communicate with them, if you wanted to do work in China, you would expect to learn Mandarin or some other dialect. If you wanted to, do work in Russia, you would expect to learn Russian, right? So this is the same idea here. If you want to work with technology, you want to start developing those language skills. Now that can be, computer languages. I'm a big proponent of math. So it's not just looking at the math as a bunch of symbols. It's stepping back and what do those symbols mean? Okay. And if you're capable of stepping back, even if it's like a simple equation, mathematically speaking, and you can translate it into English, okay, or any other language, you are so far ahead of the curve. Because not only can you talk with people that are not technical, but you're going to be able to talk with technical people about what might be intangible ideas. And I think the challenge with AI going forward is getting the programming and objective functions and such so they best represent the intangibles that the humanities and social sciences are really concerned about, and rightly so. So, what does it mean to be human? You can still use math to talk about being human, but you need to be smart about it.
David, and I don't, I'm just briefly going to use this as an example because I think that there are some students who will be listening. I was teaching ratios the other night in my entrepreneurship capstone class, and students admitted that they really didn't like the accounting class where they had to do those calculations. And my understanding was that, because of the way that they feared doing the calculations, as well as not fully understanding what story the calculations told. So I tried to set their minds at ease and said, well, you really should be able to, if you're a business major, or even if you're studying some of the social sciences, right, you should be able to understand some of these, like reading financial statements, and think of it in terms of telling a story. What's happening in this particular company, right? For example, what was happening with WeWork as it came to the way that they manage their properties. You could actually see that story being told in the numbers but you needed to know kind of how to read it. And I think we need to really reassure our students much more that you need to simply understand that, as you say, I love the idea that it's a language. I don't mean for you to comment necessarily because I'm conscious of time.
Yeah.
But I think it's just a slight nuanced way of having students think about it in terms of storytelling that we can all relate to. It would go a long way to reassuring them.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Just to expand on that for a moment, that kind of distinction is critical when you're looking at how people misinterpret certain economic data, right? So, for example, something like GDP, we presented it measured in terms of monetary value. That doesn't mean, all right, we have this amount of money and we can split it up. It is an estimate of how valuable the production has been, and we use that to compare with what we've done in the past or what we think is going to happen in the future. There are technical reasons why we use money as a measure, but it doesn't have to be that. And this is really important if you're paying attention at all to people that are getting very critical of billionaires, and in some cases rightly so. But this notion of okay, someone's got $100 billion, just divide that up by 8 billion people, and everybody gets a little bit of something. But they don't have $100 billion. They own equity in businesses. They own real estate that have values that are estimates of how much you might be able to sell them for. But in fact, it's not cash. It's the capacity to produce things. It's the capacity to have land. And if you understand that distinction, it allows you to come up with better policies and a better sense of where things are at. And that's why I'd want to encourage people, don't be afraid of the math. All right, I mean, if you're afraid, you're afraid. I don't want to invalidate your being afraid or scared of it, but learn how to be courageous in the face of numbers and math if you need to. Because as you said, there is so much there. There are stories, right? The notion of forensic accounting, a lot of what happens in our justice system is thanks to, forensic accountants. If you hear the phrase, follow the money, you got to be able to, follow the math. So even if it, gets you upset, find the courage, because there's just so much to be understood there. Okay. Any other questions before I?
There is a question,
Yeah.
David, if I can read it from the chat.
Yep.
This one comes from, I believe the name is Sammy. If I'm mispronouncing it, my apologies. The question that has been posed is, why do we expect AI to perform an objective function when we as human beings who are responsible for creating it and teaching it are biased? Furthermore, does bias necessarily mean injustice? What about judges? Why do we trust them within our judicial system when we know that they are humans with biases? So that is the question that has been posed. We're keen to hear your answer.
Excellent question. To be fair, Sammy is with me right now, and he was one of my students, and every class he would ask a question like that. So thank you for continuing to play the game. So first, to be clear, when we talk about objective function, it's objective not in the sense of not subjective, but objective as what is the object? What are you trying to accomplish? So I want to be clear on this distinction in that term. Now, in terms of biases, that is a huge issue in AI, right? Because this gets back to what I was trying to get at when talking about the experience of decision making, and that the choices we make today don't just impact what's feasible tomorrow. They're choices about what of our history do we keep, right? So one of the deep biases that we've been dealing with is essentially how our European heritage has kind of said, no, if it didn't come from Europe, it wasn't important. And what we're finding is, well, first of all, that's not true. And second, our world's issues are so challenging, we can't afford to ignore genius and insight and wisdom just because it didn't come from our particular culture. Okay. So yeah, we have to deal with something with that bias against where knowledge and wisdom has come in the past. That doesn't mean that it can't be criticized. We can't say, well, is that still relevant? But we shouldn't be saying, no, I'm not even going to bother it, with it offhand, because it didn't come out of a Western European tradition. So how could it possibly be useful? That's not helping. The other issue about dealing with judges and politicians, all with their biases, you could say that is the great democratic work to be done, right? We are individuals. What makes us individual is we have our own perspective. And what we have as our own perspective is based not so much on what we know and what we're aware of, but what we ignore. At the core of economics of mind is that we have a limited capacity for processing information, for holding information, for taking into account different perspectives, for taking into account the well-being of other people. Okay, like very, very quickly, the way to make this point. Imagine you were going to spend 1 second talking to everybody on the planet, one-on-one, 1 second, okay? Just long enough to find out what their pronoun is, okay? 1 second. If you did nothing else, you didn't sleep, you didn't eat, you didn't, move around, you didn't do anything except 1 second, 8 billion times in a row, finding out everyone's pronoun. How long is that going to take?
It would be 8 times 30.
It's
1 billion seconds is 30 years.
So it would be 8 billion seconds. There's about 30 million seconds in a year. It would take over 200 years doing nothing but 1 second for every 8 billion. So it's not even feasible. This is an example of understanding the distinction between what's feasible and what's acceptable. So it may very well be that we would like to have the acceptable standard as, you should ask everyone, their pronoun. But in terms of what's feasible, I couldn't do that. I could not ask everyone. Now, That's being human and connecting with someone else as a human, where the limitations come in. But much of the way we understand the world now comes out of using statistics and data and being able to use the technology to accelerate these processes. So, for example, we talk about AI as artificial intelligence, but maybe a better way of saying AI is accelerated inference, right? To be able to make conclusions and decisions much, much faster than any individual human can. But then you have to have that built into the algorithm. And now it's the question of who gets to say what the algorithm is. Okay. And if you're not the person who can actually write the software, or at least look at the math and say, well, at least make sure that this is the math in it. You know, it's like trying to understand, I don't know, 16th century French literature, and you can't speak French. You know, you're completely dependent on the translation of others. And you know, they have their own biases and issues, their own priorities. Okay. So I don't know, Sammy, is that that help?
Yeah.
Okay. I hope that helps everyone else too. Okay. Any other questions, or shall I move on? Okay.
There's no other questions at the moment. Thank you.
Great. All right. So experiences is economic goods. So experiences can be broken down into impressions and expression. Okay. So impressions is sort of what you take in. Expressions are kind of what you're putting out into the world. And I like to use this as a way of getting at what's going on. So there's the external environment, then there's an interface with how we connect, okay, with the external environment. And then there's the internal environment. That's what's inside of us as a decision maker, as an entity that's experiencing. And within that internal environment, we take events toward us, input, and they go through filters and paradigms and beliefs about the external world. And that's what leaves the impressions inside of us. Those impressions, though, lay the foundation for what our instincts are, our habits, our reasons, and our beliefs about ourselves. And those, in turn, inform how we want to express ourselves into the world. And our actual expressions then go through that interface and output into the world. And all of that requires energy. And the insight here is that whatever that processing is going on inside of yourself, if your expressions lead to a response in the environment where you end up with more energy, then you create a constructive feedback loop that gives you more energy, that allows you to express yourself more. On the other hand, if your expressions start cutting you off from energy, and energy can be actual energy, it can be finances, it could be your relationships with other people. So if your expressions are sort of exciting the environment around you, you're likely to get more energy coming your way to keep that process going. If your expressions are turning people off are very depressing, at some point you're going to get less and less energy, okay? And then the internal environment can start closing down. And this was intended to be insights about the economics of psychological energy, what's going on in our minds, and how we choose to behave, and how we choose to interpret the world. However, this also has a very interesting overlay with the circular flow model of markets. And if you've had Econ 101 or 102, you've probably seen this. It's the simplest model of how the market works. There are businesses that produce and sell products, and households buy them. And there is a product market, that's where households buy things and businesses sell. And then there is a resource market. That's where households sell things like their labor or possibly, property that they own. And businesses buy it to make those products. So we could say the markets, those markets are the interface between households and businesses. Okay. And this also provides us some insight because of the deep psychology that's involved here. Okay, if you're involved with marketing at all, you're getting into some very deep psychology of consumer psychology and influencing what their priorities and what their preferences are. It's a very demand side focus. That's very important because a lot of policy perspectives, especially since the time of Ronald Reagan, has been very supply side and has kind of argued, you don't have to worry about the demand side. When in fact, almost all of marketing is about the demand side. Okay. Now, again, this is looking at it as the household as, as being the inner world and the businesses and the rest of the economy being the outer world. But there's also the social perspective in which the whole of the market is the internal environment. Okay. And so this relates to that flow of impressions and expressions and sense of identity and reasons, right? And beliefs about the world. So we're not just selling tangible products, we're selling experiences, right? We're marketing memes, right? We're marketing senses of identity. All of this is going on simultaneously, okay? And so if you're trying to understand a state or a country as if it is a whole single individual, now the market is part of that internal environment of that society as a whole. This is why it's important to be clear about, are you taking a more, humanities, internal environment view of what's going on, or more of an external? And you could be using the same words, but if the perspective is different, you're disagreeing with each other. You're not even understanding what each other is trying to say. And this is part of the challenge of doing anything interdisciplinary. It's you come in wanting to say something and then having to leave going, oh, well, maybe I don't want to say that. Maybe I need to say it a little differently. Okay. And let's have a little fun. Social circular flow of impression, expression, and energy. And hopefully what you'll be noticing is this image of the experience of decision-making. And the idea is that in that circular flow, social circular flow, right, the expression, the output of one person is the input of another. And if it is set up in a certain way, if you have your nodes set up, your neural network set up in this circular flow pattern, all of a sudden that notion of what we're experiencing ceases to be linear. Okay. And now we run into that question of, well, do we want to just keep recycling the energy so we get the biggest glow, right? The brightest expression of what we have? Or do we need to connect with other decision making so that that flow continues to expand outward and there's a possibility for growth and development? Okay, any questions on this before I continue? Okay. All right, so entrepreneurship, supply and demand. At the core of this, entrepreneurs kind of have two approaches. One, they use innovation and invention to try to reduce the cost of production or, to produce something new, hence trying to increase supply. On the other hand, they can use the technology and elements of marketing to expand the perception of benefits and hence increase demand. Now, the really effective entrepreneurs recognize that you need to increase demand at the same time that you increase supply because you need someone who's going to buy. It's not just a matter of producing more. You also need people or businesses who want to buy it. And again, this gets into the question of how is AI going to be used? It is typically presented from a supply side as, well, this is going to be advances in technology. It'll allow us to reduce the cost of production. Maybe we'll be able to use less in the way of natural resources. Maybe we'll be able to be more efficient and maybe not pollute as much, bring down our carbon footprint, possibly. But knowing how markets work, how businesses work to focus on traditional concepts of profit, AI is clearly also being used to increase demand. And so whether or not it has those proposed benefits of advancing technology depends on what exactly is getting produced and where marketing believes that the greatest profitability is going to arise. This is relevant to justice because if we're talking about producing justice, then the technology is, can we produce justice experiences at a lower cost? Can we increase the supply of justice experiences? Or is it going to be more traditional marketing where we're going to end up using AI and related to increase people's demand for justice experiences, which if it's more that way, then market pressures will let us know that the price for justice experiences will go up. Okay. So even if we have more of this technology, if the expansion of the demand for justice experiences proceeds faster than our capacity to produce them, we may end up with an awkward situation where, in fact, we are producing more justice experiences, but people may be feeling like the world is becoming more unjust because the demand is outstripping the supply. Do we have a question? Jason, you look like you were going to say something. Okay. Oh, can't hear you.
I was just looking for the unmute button. Sorry, I was looking for the unmute button. No, I'm keeping my eye on it. Thank you.
Good. All right. So justice impressions. So those are going to, be dealing with things like senses and feelings and thoughts and inspirations. And this will be important because if you're talking about a justice experience, one way of understanding a justice experience is, do you get your day in court? for example, all right? But if you're talking about justice as social aesthetic, it may be, well, am I feeling, does my community feel like it is having a more just experience of the world? Okay. Justice expressions, actions, emotions. I like to make the distinction between feelings and emotions in the same way as feelings are impressions that are left with you, but emotions, you're trying to put something out to the world. Right? Thought versus speech, inspirations versus exaltations. Okay. So again, justice experience is not necessarily just, how I'm feeling about it, but do I get to express myself in the world? So being able to protest, well, that can be understood as a form of justice experience. Maybe you don't get what you really, really want, but just the act of expressing, okay, may be valuable in and of itself. All right. So we talked about justice and now distance. And so distance and justice, distance is important because we're going to get into what are the measures that you would want included in AI. So distance from, distance to, and distance through justice. So distance from justice, if you were to have scales, it's how unbalanced are the scales, okay? So a distance of 0 means that the present moment is just, it is balanced. The larger the distance, the greater the injustice. And notice, whether one side is higher or the other, the distance goes up. So it's almost like an absolute value in a mathematical sense. Distance to justice is relative to an ideal justice and has to deal with the resources and behavioral changes required to achieve it. So how much of what you need to put into the pans, that's in some sense your distance to justice, right? How much time, how much effort, maybe, how much money, okay? So that's not, the distance that you're out of justice as the first one, but, how far away are you from it? And then distance through justice. This is the duration traveled through just moments. And so the idea here is if your social identity is one of a just being, you will want longer durations. So if we're talking about time, a longer distance of time going through justice. Okay, and we're getting very close to the end. All right, what about the holistic? Holistic justice experiences, again, comes from the recognition that real world events, right, are generating these impressions and expressions and energy changes through many individuals and of many different identities, and they propagate throughout society. So it's not as simple as, well, if we get this one moment, balanced correct, everything will be fine, right? It's you balance that moment, it may make other moments and other individuals out of balance and keeps that going. So this is one of the challenges that we face in trying to move ahead with justice. And, where AI might come into play. So one of the criticisms of AI, as was kind of brought up before, as it's, some have said it doesn't have a soul. It doesn't have emotions. Well, I mean, think about Lady Justice, wearing a blindfold, or in our case, the VR goggles, right? The idea was not to let emotions determine, whether you're in a moment of justice, because if you don't like the outcome, even if it's just, you might be outraged by it. Okay. Or, another person might. So we're dealing with that. And that's why we need to talk about justice experiences and not just, moments of what's happening in court. Okay. And this gets us to dealing with the future. So those of you that are familiar with present value calculation, right? This is how we make determinations about whether to invest, whether if we're doing a cost-benefit analysis, do we go with one project or another? This is used all over the place. It's used in businesses, it's used in government. It's very, very important. The challenge is that whatever you're doing, even if you were to get the prices correct, right? If you were to get the forecasts on what income is going to go in or what expenses are going to go out, you still need to use what's called a discount rate. How do you discount future net income? And the basic thinking is, if you put money in a savings account, especially a CD more recently, and maybe you're getting 4 or 5%. If you want $1,000 in a year, you don't need to put 1,000 in now, right? You have to put in like about 996. And, if it's a 1-year difference, it's not so much. But if you're starting to talk about 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road, as you discount, and the more you discount, the closer you get to just ignoring the future. And so in this graph, we look at different discount rates. And as we see, if you have like a 25% discount rate, which is not unusual for people, 3 years into the future is weighted only half as much as today. All right. So this is one of the reasons people tend to be myopic. And it means that, hey, I got a problem I got to deal with right now. I can't be worried about what's going to happen in 2 generations. But if you're starting to deal with businesses that might have potentially a longer time horizon, and certainly governments, right? And cultures that might have very long time horizons, they're going to be using much lower discounting. And so this is something that we choose. This comes under the realm of what is the inspirable? What are our internal preferences over the priorities that we make? And again, this is not just about the future. It's also about the past. How much of the past are we going to bring with us? And if we pull this all together, there is a sort of institutional taxonomy that comes into play. So on the bottom is that momentary self. It's what it would be considered an infinite discounting. The momentary self is like, you're not worried about what's happening tomorrow. You're not worried about what's happening in the past. Just whatever is the joy or pleasure or satisfaction of the moment. Okay. Traditionally, in economics and finance, we assume that the discounting, it's a positive time preference, which means you'd rather have more income now than in the future. And that gives us the realm of these for-profit entities that we see on the right. But if we're going to talk about our history and our past as something that's valuable, then we start asking, well, how much do we discount the past? Well, if what you're interested in is leading edge research, you're probably not that concerned about the past because you want your most recent research to be weighted. And then the further you want the past to carry on, the more you go from, let's say, research focus to liberal education to tradition education. Okay. And again, the perspective here has to deal with how much do you want the past to continue to come along. And then there's the notion of the governing. And that can also be understood as the transcendent, where you don't discount the past or the future. And it itself is the totality of a moment. And so that gets back into, with respect to AI and that objective function, how are we discounting the future and the past? Okay. You know, who is our AI being? Right? And these algorithms. Okay. And this is the last slide. The issue around justice as redistribution. Do we need to create justice mutual funds? Okay. Especially knowing that the future is going to view what we do today as unjust in the same way as we look at the past and say, oh, that was just horrible what they did. Okay. It is almost definitely going to be the case that generations will look at today and find something that was unfair to them. Okay. What share of settlements today should go into these funds? Okay. So, you know, we decide certain people today, you know, should get reparations, you know, redistribution. But of that, how much should go to put into funds for what's going to happen in the future? Okay. And then all of this gets down to, will it be necessary to use AI and related technology to have such a comprehensive justice system? And that really pushes another question, which is, do we even have the resources and energy to use that as a comprehensive justice system? How much do we have to invest of what we produce just to keep the justice system that we have? Because it will take time and effort and resources every time we try to change and update our justice system. Okay, so those are kind of questions to end this with. Jason, Ethne?
Thank you very much, David. Ethne? Yes, go ahead, Ethne.
Question before anybody else, perhaps to allow the audience to generate some questions. You know, this was amazing. So first, I want to thank you for a very deep and very philosophical look at, you know, what underpins this moment. I think in all of the materials that I either read or watch about AI, this is by far the best sort of deep set of questions that certainly from this interdisciplinary perspective, I feel others have not really touched upon. So thank you very much. I want to ask you how your framework, sort of the setting up of the economic framework, how you accommodate the idea from Herbert Simon, who won the Nobel Prize, as you know, for his idea of optimizing versus satisficing. And the reason I'm asking that is in entrepreneurship, we have started very much pushing back against the idea that we always optimize, or that we even should always optimize. And the person who came up with the framework for this is somebody who did a PhD in entrepreneurship with Herbert Simon. She is an academic at the University of Virginia. Her name is Sarah Sarasvathy. And she frames this as entrepreneurs actually very seldom optimize. They effectuate. So they take what they have and they work with that. So can we perhaps in the future, certainly you and I will speak offline, but can you accommodate the idea of satisficing? And maybe you could explain better than I can to the audience the idea of satisficing.
Sure. So the distinction between optimizing and satisficing at its core, I mean, you're pretty much saying it. Optimizing is the idea of given all the information, the technology, all the resources that you have, picking either that which maximizes profit, so the potential gain from what you're doing, or minimizing the cost. Okay. Because sometimes you're in a no-win situation, but that doesn't mean, everything is equally bad.
Yeah.
Right? You probably would rather have 3 days in jail than 3 years in jail, for example. Satisficing has the advantage of saying, okay, what do we need to achieve? And what is necessary to achieve that? And it allows you a certain robustness. So if you're optimizing, you're kind of picking like this one thing, because that's the best way to go. And from a mathematical standpoint, if the objective function is relatively smooth, if you try to optimize, you're likely to get at least pretty close to that. But if the resources and such are not smooth, right? If it has to do with global and local maximums and minimums, local extremum, it is possible that you try to go to do the very, very best, but if you're off a little bit, you actually get a really bad outcome. Sometimes we see this when we talk about uncanny valleys, right? As the virtual gets closer and closer to it as an approximation, sometimes what we get is just very disturbing. And we prefer something a little bit off. By the way, that's also very similar to music. If you've got 2 tones and you have one getting closer and closer, the dissonance really maximizes for a little bit as you're getting closer until you're very, very close. And then it dissipates. So in terms of the framework that I'm proposing, this comes into the realm of what's acceptable. So if you're doing satisficing, you're saying, well, look, if we can at least get this level of an outcome, that's acceptable. And now you could start asking the question, how much resources is necessary to come up with a satisfying solution as compared to an optimizing solution? Because if it takes less resources to come up with a satisfying one, then in fact, you have more resources to get the satisfying solution than the optimizing one. And that's a very interesting twist, because it's saying if you're willing to let go, trying to do the very, very best, you may actually end up with a better outcome.
Yeah, that was well explained.
Thank you for that, David. With that, we are at 1:29, about a minute shy of when we said that we were going to close. David, thank you so much for your lecture today. We really enjoyed having an opportunity to hear from you and what you shared. As a reminder to everybody on this call, there is another seminar on October 16th. Stay tuned for information about that. We will also, as I said, be sharing the slides and the video from today's presentation on the RIG site. You can check that out on the RIG site beginning next week. And with that, we thank you for being here today, and we hope you all have a nice weekend. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.